We previously have done a session on children's mental health, the children's mental health crisis, which focused on the invisible child, a young girl named, not so young after a while, Dasani, and her family, who were stuck in a hellhole of a homeless shelter and their struggle to get out. But the idea that children's mental health is under assault, we're not saying anything radical by saying that. It's constantly appearing. In fact, I belong to the American Association of Retired Persons, and we get a monthly newsletter. And the first topic was the reduction in drug prices payments because by the new Biden legislative program. But the second thing it focused on was on deterioration in children's mental health from the standpoint that these are grandparents that they're communicating with. What can they do? And now I'm going to switch to a second mode where that was dealt with. The New York, Boston Children, it's called Boston Children. We would think of it as Boston Children's Hospital, had a paid advertisement in the New York Times. And in a way, both the AARP newsletter and Boston Children gave the same message. And it was titled, How Early Intervention Improves Children's Mental Health Outcomes. And so what both are premised on is the recognition that we're in a disaster with youth mental health. And the answer to that is to plug them in to the mental health system. And of course, Boston Children is an example of that. This is a quote from the Times. It's an ad. Even before the pandemic, anxiety and depression were becoming more common among children and adolescents, increasing 27% and 24% respectively from 2016 to 2019. By 2020, 10%, 5.6 million kids have been diagnosed with anxiety problems, and 2.4 million, 5%, have been diagnosed with depression. So everybody knows this, and we've talked about that on LPP, Zach and I, how to address that from within the school system, which is his that's his milieu. So why they give an example under the heading Confronting the Crisis, why rewriting children's mental health outcomes begins with early intervention. And they talk about Isabel. Well, I'll describe Isabel a little bit more later. Isabel is a member of a generation experienced a spike in psychological distress so worrying that the American Academy of Pediatrics has declared a national emergency in children's mental health. A 2-year study of Boston Children's admissions revealed increases in the proportion of adolescents presenting to the hospital with anxiety, depression, eating disorders, suicidal ideation, and self-harm during the first year of the COVID-19 pandemic. Though the pandemic exacerbated challenges for kids and teenagers, rates of depression, anxiety, self-harm, and suicide among young Americans have been steadily increasing for years. What do you think about that statement?
Which one? The last bit?
Yeah. What could be worse to say about America that this is happening?
Yeah.
And then I'm back to the ad. Scientists are still examining the root causes of the growing crisis. But when it comes to the urgency of addressing it, they're in agreement. Isn't that funny? That with all of our expertise, they're still trying to figure out, according to this, well, how are they what's causing this? But we know how to address it.
Right. I still think it's fun. Right. I think it's even funnier, more ironic that it's a clear statement. No one knows what's going on. And it seems like even clearer statement. Don't worry. We know what to do. We know what to do, even though we don't know what the problem is. So, yes.
I left out the first paragraph of the ad, and I'm going to read it to you now.
Yeah.
When 14-year-old Isabel was admitted to Boston Children's, she had been suffering from stomach pain for 6 weeks. A comprehensive evaluation, which included a psychiatry assessment, revealed that she had signs of gastritis and had gone through a difficult breakup shortly before her symptoms started. She described the relationship as emotionally abusive. And since the split, she suffered from escalating anxiety, panic attacks, and thoughts of suicide. Whew. So now they're saying, well, she had to come to Boston Children's to deal with those things, anxiety, panic attacks, and thoughts of suicide, as well as, her stomach pains.
Mm-hmm.
And gosh, we don't know what causes that. And what caused it in the instance was an abusive relationship by a 14-year-old. But do you notice they don't say anything at all about Isabel? And this, of course, this reminds me of things that you talk about, Zach, that you're sometimes in a setting where they bring in a report about a child, and then you say something like, well, has anybody asked the child what was going on? And so they say nothing. There's nothing in here about, well, what does Isabel think about the relationship and why she got into that relationship? There's nothing here about, if you had to guess, Zach, what would be one of the background factors that led to Isabel getting in an abusive romantic relationship, what would you guess, sight unseen? It's unfair for me to throw these questions out to you. So sorry.
Well, no, because I'm trying to think about what I would do professionally. What I wouldn't start by guessing. So
that's important.
I reject the hypothetical in some way.
That's important. And that's with the utmost respect to you but they're not.
But that's what we're doing. Yeah. So sorry.
You use a process, but they don't mention a process. The process would be to find out something about her life.
Right.
And one guess might be that she has a family problems. That's awful.
I see what you're saying. I would. You're right. When you put it that way, I probably wouldn't guess in the sense of I would make an assumption, but that's something you'd explore. Why is a 14-year-old girl getting into a relationship that's so abusive? What's going on with her? Right. I see what you're saying. I wouldn't be starting to take pictures of her brain. I might be exploring a little bit more about her other relationships in her family. Yeah. Right.
Obviously, you'd like to know about her social situation. I mean, is she poor?
Right.
Is she homeless? We know nothing about Isabel. Now, when she goes into Boston Children's and she gets into this early intervention, is there such a thing? Do they have a diagnosis of tendency to get in abusive relationships? They don't have that. That's not a thing.
Yeah.
They have anxiety disorder, panic attacks, depression, suicide. They come up with a diagnosis, which, to judge from what they say here, is based on strictly the symptoms that she arrives at the hospital with.
Right.
No indication about what you so eloquently put. Your job would be to find out where this is coming from. That's so evident. That's so obvious. And going back to the AARP newsletter, I think a lot of the grandparents would know that. They'd want to say, well, I'd like to know, if this is my grandchild, what's going on with the family that led to this. So I imagine when confronted by the Boston Children's ad or the AARP saying the same thing, get them into intervention programs, are not enough children on psychiatric drugs? That's what's going to happen. They're going to get a diagnosis and be put on psychiatric drugs. That's what's going to happen. In the United States today, 1 in 12 children are on psychiatric drugs. That includes preschoolers, but it gets up to 13% of 12 to 17-year-olds are on psychiatric drugs. 1 in 8 are on psychiatric drugs. And then in my provocative style, I would imagine. So what do you think will be the result of getting more people into intervention? And they always say only a minority of children with psychiatric problems are being given the proper treatment, meaning being put in a place in the medical context and being given psychiatric drugs. So I always imagine, what's the proper percentage that you're shooting for of teens who are diagnosed and treated with drugs?
Right.
Is it 20%? Is that what you're shooting for? Is it 50%? Is it all of the children? And my point is, who is responsible for imagining from whence this depression, anxiety is occurring? Or going back to Isabel, that's a fake name, of course. Where is it coming from that she's getting into an abusive relationship? Why is this happening? And they're not, even though it appears in the New York Times as an ad, nobody's going to answer that.
I always remember talking to Jonathan. They'll be quick, and it's not quite in line with what you're saying, but John Pfaff, a guy from Fordham University, wrote a book called Locked In about our overpopulation in prisons. And he asked the same question, which made me ask that question about every problem that I've ever faced. In his book, he asked, when people say that prisons are overcrowded, first, I just want to know, what is the proper population of a prison? And so usually people have no answer to that, but they usually start to think, oh, I didn't think this through. And so from that, he says, okay, now what are the questions we ought to be asking about what it means to go to prison, or what's going on to keep somebody from going to prison? And when you said that just now, that's how I'm always thinking about things now. It's too easy to say, golly gee, more people should be on psychiatric drugs. Why aren't we doing that enough? You just asked that question. How many people ought to be on psychiatric drugs? Okay, maybe that's not the fundamental question. So, but you and I are not. You work in the school system. Yeah, we have a life process program, which is a way of helping people in their own homes address their addiction type issues. But we're about turning everything over to institutionalized resources. Yeah, doesn't solve the problem. And, other people recognize this. There have been a lot of people, bestsellers by Alexander and others, about depopulating prisons. And we're not against people being punished for crimes. We believe in that. But the idea, what we're focusing on is a family saying, oh, I'll turn it over to the hospital, they'll solve it. That's the source of the problem. AARP, like many other people, that's interesting, the newsletter focused on iPhones. Depression and anxiety have increased, especially around addiction to electronic devices, but specifically iPhones, because iPhones are allowed to be with kids constantly. So children are in constant touch with their iPhone. And you and I have both witnessed this among people we know. And what is this all about? To a certain extent, how do we define addiction? We define addiction as people turning to an imported experience as a way of mediating their own direct experience, which they find too difficult and painful to manage. And that explains both drug and alcohol addiction and electronic and iPhone addiction. And in fact, when you think about it, it's difficult to get a steady influx of drugs and alcohol. But iPhones, you can be attached to your iPhone virtually, perpetually. But here's the part where we get back to the Münchausen syndrome in Proxy. Parents actually, in a lot of regards, welcome
this state of events. Because when the kid is addicted to the iPhone, they're not leaving the house. They're in their bedroom. And there's a kind of a fear and an anxiety about children being out of their homes. Underlying all of this is a kind of fear. Now, this Münchausen syndrome is where a person invents a disease for themselves, and then they get treatment for it. Münchausen syndrome in Proxy is where you develop a diagnosis for a child.
Right.
And I'll throw it back on you again. Why would a parent do that?
Two reasons. One is to be the savior of that child, to be seen as the savior of that child. Because if your child has an ailment and you're the only one who knows about it, then you're the expert on this illness and you're, remarkable to everybody else. Well, God bless you for what you do to the kid. The other reason is to this illusory sense of protecting your child. If your child has some sort of diagnosis and you're taking care of your child and you need to perpetually take care of your child, that means you get to sort of, in some fantasy in your mind, keep your arms wrapped around them. They never have to see that you can keep them in a bubble.
So you're protecting your child and helping them, and at the same time, they're totally dependent on you.
Right.
And you and I we made a little bit of an effort to, you did an interview with the authoress, the inventor of free range children. We weren't entirely successful. What's her name, Zach?
Lenore Skenazy.
We weren't entirely successful when I listened to the interview. You weren't, through no fault of your own. What we were saying to her is her allowing her small child to independently go to Bloomingdale's and take the subway is our answer to a child stuck in a bedroom on a cell phone, never going out, and avoiding all fears, but at the same time losing a lot of essential skills and abilities. We tried to make this connection between the absence of direct experience, which is now the modus operandi for kids. People used to worry about their kids going to the mall and all of the things they got up to, and parents still worry about that. And instead, they've got a child in the bedroom now, constantly attached to their cell phone or some comparable kind of a device. And you can't make up for the absence of direct experience. There's no remedy for doing that. And one strange thing, and you might observe this and have opinions about this, Zach, children are much more sophisticated electronically now, but people know that children today, teenagers, actually seem more immature than in the past. It's a funny thing. We think, well, they're so sophisticated now, but they've got so much less direct experience of the world and of other people. If we go back, we originally talked about a girl who's going to be diagnosed for having an abusive relationship. She didn't really know maybe how to experience a positive relationship. What we tried to make Skenazy see, but we were entirely successful, is the relationship between the free-range child that she talked about, her small boy, and avoiding addiction. We couldn't totally get around with Skenazy. You couldn't in interviewing her. The idea that addiction is not the result of a drug. It's a way of channeling and relating to an experience. And when you think about it, an iPhone is the most direct way of modifying your experience that is possible. It's constant in a way that it's even the worst drug addict or alcoholic can't manage.
Yeah, she was interesting. I guess should have, if I went back to do it again, I would have led with that. She was, first of all, thinking addiction. Well, that's something that's not my bailiwick. That's like drugs and stuff. And I don't know anything about drugs. I'm not a pharmacist. And so when I made the connect, do you remember I was talking to Skenazy about, I talked about this sort of trend among kids and then talked about addiction, and got confused and said, well, I don't know, from my reading, it looks like people are having less sex than ever. People are not using their phones as much. People aren't using drugs as much. What's up with that?
Well, they're using phones more, but they're not using drugs as much.
Sorry, I didn't mean to say phones. And I just, in my mind, I just haven't, it's the curse of knowledge. You know, we've sort of articulated this thing as addiction incorporates all of these things. And in real time, it's hard to get somebody to make the connection. I think we were talking about this before. It would have, like, a nice prepping conversation could have done the trick. But anyway, I understand I understand why other people can't make the connection.
People immediately switch into the drugs thing.
Right.
And so, you know, to some, we feel the fundamental dynamic is parents out of fear welcoming the marshaling and overprotection, as you described it, of their children, almost welcoming iPhone addiction at the same time that they're frightened by it and they see the negative consequences of it. And at the same time that the AARP newsletter and Boston Children are saying, gosh, children are really in the worst mental shape possible. And the AARP newsletter specifically spends time identifying iPhones as the source of that.
In other words, the thing you're describing is parents saying indirectly, don't go experience the world. Don't make mistakes you can learn from. Don't, see and experience new things that could be scary to me for you to experience. And I'm going to live in this world in my mind that says, if I can keep you in your room, you're going to be okay. And they do it while knowing that those are things that people need to develop wisdom and reasonable lives and connections with people. So it's
and even Skenazy, who we would hope would have some recognition of that, says, but look, kids are having less sex.
Right, doing
less drinking now.
Right.
It's sort of working. At the same time, over in this box, people are saying we're at a mental health crisis with children. It's constant. It's perpetual mental health disaster for children. Alarm disaster month.
But if I were in a worse mood that day, I might have said something like, "Are you anti-sex? Are you anti-alcohol?" And have her describe it and take it from there and try to meet her somewhere in the middle. But I was feeling.
It's a time when we admire Skenazy, and it was just a disappointment.
Yeah.
She expressed discontent. Her own son, who was a free-range child, is graduating college, and she's worried about his purposefulness. We see those things, being allowed to navigate your youthful environment and then being able and willing and motivated to navigate your adult environment as being, it seems so obvious to us, a direct link. Right. I want to end with one, just to give a proper set of alarm to all of this. I just want to, and to go back, remember Isabel. Remember the girl who's going into Boston Children to be diagnosed for anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation. Nobody's going to ask her or give her the skills to have a relationship. Nobody's going to conceptualize, well, you need to understand to learn some ways of dealing with people. Of course, do you really teach that in a hospital? Yeah. Or do you learn that by going out and playing with children? The worst thing that's happened recently in New York City is a woman drowned her 3 children. A decade ago, she aspired to a career in healthcare, and then they go on to her resume and how she was making some effort. But then there was her personal life. This is in the Times. Plagued by a series of ill-fated relationships that left her with 3 children from 3 fathers. It sounds like where Isabel could go. Somebody who might, there's no diagnosis, there's no addiction to sex or love on DSM-5. That's not a thing. And there's no way of getting to the bottom of Isabel's tendency to get involved in those relationships. Yet the woman who drowned her 3 children, one an infant, is somebody who was a victim of that. I'm reading from the Times. She was overcome by mental health problems, custody battles, unpaid bills, legal and financial problems. A pending eviction could have ended her and landed her and the children back in the homeless shelter they had escaped last year. Standing at the shoreline, Ms. Murdy had fallen far short of becoming the stable, productive woman she had once envisioned. Well, we had an earlier session on a woman in a homeless shelter, a girl, Dasani, and her mother, Chanel, in a homeless shelter. And so this little summary links the 2 things. How an inability to come to grips with life, in particular relationships, intimate relationships, sexual relationships. As you said, you might have asked Skenazy, well, how do you think children are going to learn about sex and relationships? What do you imagine is the best way for that to happen? And what we've said is that we're in a system, the worst system is an addictive system where people follow out a destructive pattern and they do it out of motivation that makes sense to them and is reassuring to them, but it's destructive. Now, I'm not talking about the young women and their relationships. I'm talking about the parents and how they deal with their children.
Man. So that's sort of, there were a few things. I'm going back to our previous segment. So if people haven't seen it yet, I guess at this point we will have published a segment that we call The Invisible Child, written by a woman last name Elliott. And she was talking about one of a multifactorial system of problems that people face when they're in poverty, is that the systems that are created to save them, first of all, don't speak to each other. And second of all, those systems themselves often create more problems. You know, they're supposed to be handling one part of a person's life, but they could create more problems both for that person ongoing or in the system, their social system or family system. And in a way, we as parents, and wealthy parents, often create this same sort of a problem for their children. That, you know, there are some specific issues that they are hoping to extinguish in a child's life, and part of it is because that will make me look good as a parent, and part of it is because, well, I don't know another way to keep my kids safe. But what we all kind of know we're doing is thwarting opportunities for our children to learn things on their own with our guidance. It's almost like saying it's the same. There's a wealthy version of the invisible child that is parents themselves saying, well, there are a lot of problems you'll face, honey, in childhood, but I'm going to sweep those under the rug as long as I can. And, you know, I'm going to cross my fingers and hope that it doesn't explode in my or your face later in life. And so that's something.
Maybe doing something even worse in the middle class context, the privileged context. We're voluntarily turning children over with psychiatric diagnostic mechanism, which gives them a label,
right?
Medications that carry on in their own into the future, in place of.
Right. That was going to be my nice nightcap. There is that. That's just one of the problems, but it seems to be, if you are in this situation, and then there are cascades of problems in a child's life, or you anticipate there being problems, the easiest thing to do to get over the hurdle of looking like you're sweeping something under the rug, right, is exactly what you said. Let's hand it over to the medical professionals who know better. And then now they've totally left the auspices of their parents. They're diagnosed, and they're in this sort of a medical cycle, medicalized cycle that one can become trapped in because it's self-identifying and self-damaging.
And I just want to doff my cap to you and to point to one of the podcasts that we've done where you're enmeshed in the system trying to prevent that short circuiting by having the system, the school, and the family deal itself directly with the child and have that relationship.
We can do no less.
There's no alternative.
Well, thank you for pointing these out, Stanton. This is something that we need to think about, even if it's hard to think about or it doesn't feel nice.
There's nothing more essential or crucial, Zach. All right, good talking with you again. As always, let's power on.
Let's do it. Happy Sunday.
Happy Sunday.